In 2019, inside a Tennessee courtroom filled with reporters, victims' advocates, and supporters holding their breath, a young woman named Cyntoia Brown walked toward freedom after serving 15 long years behind bars. Her release wasn't just a legal milestone, it was a cultural moment, a reckoning about justice, trauma, and the human capacity to change. For the first time since she was 16 years old, she could step into sunlight, not filtered through steel bars or razor wire. The journey that brought her here began not with a crime, but with a childhood scarred by chaos, abuse, and survival instincts sharpened far too young. It is a story that forces us to ask, what happens when society punishes a child for the circumstances that created her? Cyntoia Denise Brown was born in 1988 in Fort Campbell, Tennessee, to a mother battling addiction and a legacy of trauma stretching back generations. Her biological mother, Georgina Mitchell, struggled with alcohol and drug abuse even while pregnant. From birth, Cyntoia was exposed to substances that affected her brain development. But what shaped her most wasn't chemistry, it was instability. Her early years were marked by neglect, foster care, and the sense of being unwanted. By the time she was adopted by Ellinette Brown, a caring schoolteacher, Cyntoia had already learned that love often came with fear. She was bright, curious, and sensitive, but the ghosts of her early life, abandonment, anger, and distrust, followed her like shadows. As a teenager, Cyntoia's world spiraled out of control. She ran away from home, seeking refuge anywhere but the structured, disciplined environment her adoptive mother tried to provide. Out on the streets, she encountered a man who called himself Cutthroat. His real name was Garion McLaughlin, but to the vulnerable 15-year-old, he became something between a boyfriend, protector, and abuser. He exploited her need for affection and turned it into dependency. "I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request." Cyntoia was just 16. She and Cutthroat were staying at a hotel when she met a 43-year-old man named Johnny Allen at a Nashville restaurant parking lot. He was a real estate agent and a former Army sharpshooter. By all accounts, Allen was respected in his community. But what happened in the hours that followed would destroy 2 lives and ignite a national conversation on justice. Johnny Allen picked her up that night, agreeing to pay her $150 for sex. He drove her to his home, a quiet, well-kept house in East Nashville. To the public later, it seemed like a simple transaction gone wrong. But what unfolded behind those walls was far more complicated, shaped by fear, trauma, and misjudgment. Inside Allen's home, Cyntoia later recalled feeling uneasy. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm. He showed her pictures of his family, bragged about his military background, and told her stories that made her feel small, exposed, and trapped. He kept weapons in the house, a fact that terrified her. According to her testimony, when they lay down on his bed, he reached for something under the bed. In her mind, it could only be one thing: a gun. Acting on pure instinct, she grabbed a firearm she had brought with her and pulled the trigger. Johnny Allen was shot once in the back of the head, instantly killed. What followed wasn't a calculated escape, it was panic. Cyntoia took some of his belongings, his truck, and fled. Later, police would find her at a motel, asleep, the gun nearby. When investigators brought her in, the interrogation was methodical, but cold. The teenage girl sitting before them wasn't treated as a victim of trafficking or abuse, but as a manipulative killer. They asked about motive, not trauma. They pressed for details of the shooting, not the years of exploitation that preceded it. Forensic teams gathered evidence: the gun, The vehicle, Allen's personal items. They reconstructed the crime scene with meticulous precision. But no one reconstructed her life. The system viewed her through a single lens, that of a criminal capable of premeditated murder. Prosecutors argued that she planned the killing to rob Allen. The state decided to charge her as an adult. In that moment, Tennessee transformed a 16-year-old girl into an adult murderer in the eyes of the law. Viewers watching this might wonder, how can a teenager who was trafficked and abused end up in adult court instead of juvenile rehabilitation? The answer lies in the harsh realities of the American justice system at the time. Tennessee law allowed minors accused of certain violent crimes to be tried as adults if a judge found probable cause. Once transferred, the juvenile loses nearly all protections of youth status. The jury would see her not as a child who pulled the trigger out of fear, but as a woman who killed for money. During her trial in 2006, prosecutors painted a picture of greed and deceit. They argued that Cyntoia lured Allen to his death. The defense countered that she acted in self-defense, a terrified girl forced into a world she didn't choose. But trauma is invisible in the courtroom. Jurors saw her as defiant, detached, emotionless, a common misunderstanding of survivors of abuse. They convicted her of first-degree murder, first-degree felony murder, and aggravated robbery. She was sentenced to life in prison. At 16, her life was effectively over. Under Tennessee law at the time, a life sentence meant she would not be eligible for parole for 51 years. She would be 67 before even having the chance to be considered for release. Imagine being a teenager told you'll die behind bars for something you barely understand. Inside prison, Cyntoia experienced depression, rage, and a loss of identity. But over time, she began to rebuild herself piece by piece. She earned her GED, then enrolled in college courses through Lipscomb University's in-prison program. She studied social justice, counseling, and the psychology of trauma, the very forces that shaped her life. Professors described her as brilliant, insightful, and deeply introspective. She began mentoring other inmates, helping them cope with abuse and regret. For the first time, she wasn't surviving. She was growing. Meanwhile, her case quietly simmered in the public conscience. In 2011, a PBS documentary titled Me Facing Life, Cyntoia's Story, brought national attention to her plight. Viewers saw the complexity of her situation. A child born into trauma, exploited by a predator, and then condemned by a justice system blind to her humanity. The film sparked outrage and empathy in equal measure. Advocates began calling for clemency, arguing that she was a victim of child sex trafficking long before the term gained widespread recognition. Even the U.S. Supreme Court had begun reevaluating harsh sentences for juveniles, ruling in cases like Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole for minors was unconstitutional. But Tennessee's interpretation still meant that life was life, 5 decades minimum. Years passed. Cyntoia continued her education, earning her bachelor's degree with a 4.0 GPA. She became a model of rehabilitation, an example of what could happen if prisons focused on transformation instead of punishment. Her writings about childhood trauma, systemic injustice, and redemption spread through advocacy networks. Celebrities and activists began to take notice. Rihanna, Kim Kardashian, and other public figures shared her story on social media, amplifying her case to millions. Hashtags like Free Cyntoia Brown trended worldwide. But behind the viral momentum was a growing legal effort. Lawyers revisited her sentencing, citing new scientific research on adolescent brain development and the effects of chronic trauma. They argued that Cyntoia was not fully capable of adult reasoning or impulse control at 16, and that the law had evolved since her conviction. In 2018, after years of petitions and appeals, her lawyers submitted a formal clemency request to Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam. It was a long shot. Clemency is rare, granted only in extraordinary circumstances. But Haslam, nearing the end of his term, had made it clear he was open to cases demonstrating rehabilitation and injustice. By this point, even the Tennessee Department of Corrections had praised Cyntoia's record, her degrees, her mentorship, her positive influence on others. Public support flooded in from the American Civil Liberties Union, faith leaders, lawmakers, and citizens who saw her not as a murderer, but as proof that redemption is possible. The governor's office received thousands of letters urging mercy. The question loomed: could the system that failed her as a child now recognize her as a changed woman? On January 7, 2019, the answer came. Governor Haslam granted clemency to Cyntoia Brown, citing her extraordinary steps toward rehabilitation and the unjust nature of her original sentence. He commuted her life term to 15 years, making her eligible for release later that year. The decision was historic. For many, it symbolized a shift in how America viewed justice, not just as retribution, but as restoration. The announcement sent ripples across the nation. Inmates wept, activists celebrated, and news outlets replayed footage of the young girl who had once stared blankly into a camera, now smiling through tears. Cyntoia Brown was finally going home. When she walked out of prison on August 7, 2019, she was 31 years old. The world she entered was not the one she had left behind. Technology, culture, even the language of justice had changed. But so had she. Her first words to the press were not of anger or bitterness, but gratitude. "I thank God, my family, my lawyers, and everyone who believed in me," she said. "I'm going to live my life to honor the support I've been given." Those words carried the weight of survival, the wisdom of loss, and the grace of forgiveness. The image of her walking free became an enduring symbol of a justice system finally bending toward compassion. In the years that followed, Cyntoia Brown, now Cyntoia Brown Long, after marrying musician and motivational speaker Jamie Long, devoted her life to advocacy. She published a memoir titled Free Cyntoia: My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, offering a raw, honest account of her journey. She began speaking publicly about human trafficking, juvenile sentencing reform, and faith-based rehabilitation. Her story reached classrooms, churches, and conferences across the country. She told young people that healing begins when you stop defining yourself by what you've done and start living for what you can become. She also spoke about forgiveness, of the men who exploited her, of the prosecutors who condemned her, and even of herself. In her words, "Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's how you take your power back." For editors producing this documentary, visuals during this phase should shift from cold blues and grays of prison interiors to warm gold tones, sunlight breaking through clouds, hands opening prison gates, the subtle glow of dawn. A timeline could fade across the screen, showing her transformation from 2004 to 2019, each milestone marked by new hope: GED, college, degree, clemency, freedom. Viewers should feel that progression, not as a montage of events, but as a heartbeat returning to rhythm after years of stillness. Cyntoia's case continues to influence national policy. It opened conversations about how courts treat trafficked minors who commit crimes under coercion. Many states have since revised their laws, recognizing that victims of sexual exploitation often act out of fear and survival, not malice. Tennessee, for instance, has expanded definitions of human trafficking and adjusted sentencing guidelines for minors. Legal scholars cite her case in discussions of restorative justice, a philosophy that seeks not just to punish wrongdoing, but to heal the harm caused by it. Her life story now serves as training material for judges, prosecutors, and social workers seeking to understand the human stories behind criminal cases. And yet, behind the triumph, there remains the haunting memory of Johnny Allen, the man who lost his life that night in 2004. His family's pain never vanished. His relatives described him as kind, generous, and caring. They questioned whether mercy for Cyntoia diminished justice for him. These perspectives deserve acknowledgement. Justice is never one-sided. A balanced retelling should honor both lives, the victims and the survivors, because both were shaped by forces larger than themselves. The tragedy lies not only in the loss of a life, but in the chain of events that made such a moment possible. Two broken paths collided in one violent instant, and the world would never be the same for either. In the end, the Cyntoia Brown story is not about guilt or innocence. It's about growth. It's about what happens when society looks at a life once written off and decides it's worth rewriting. It's a reminder that justice without compassion is incomplete, and punishment without understanding is hollow. Her transformation, from a traumatized teen to a confident advocate, shows that the most profound reform doesn't always come from new laws or court rulings, but from human hearts choosing to change. As viewers reflect on this case, one might ask, how many other Cyntoias exist, unseen behind bars, shaped by trauma rather than malice? How many children are being punished for their pain instead of being healed from it? The story compels us not to excuse wrongdoing, but to examine its roots. Because if we can understand what drives people toward darkness, we might learn how to lead them back into light. For closing visuals, the tone should turn hopeful yet contemplative. Slow aerial shots of Tennessee's skyline at sunrise. Archival photos of a teenage Cyntoia fading into her present-day smile. A quiet instrumental theme. Strings, piano, and soft percussion, rising as her voice reads one of her real quotes. "I believe God saved me for a reason. Every breath I take now is proof that change is possible." Fade out on her walking through a field, sunlight behind her, her silhouette symbolizing freedom earned, not given. Cyntoia Brown story continues to resonate because it captures something universal, the struggle to reclaim humanity in a system that often forgets it. It reminds us that accountability and empathy can coexist, that punishment can give way to restoration, and that even in the darkest corners of our justice system, light can still break through.